And for tonight, we have with us Robert Watson, and he's going to be talking to us about his newest book, Escape, the story of the Confederacy's infamous Libby prison and the Civil War's largest jailbreak. Robert Watson is an award-winning historian, author, professor, and analyst of numerous media outlets. He has published over 40 books on history and politics, 5 works of fiction, and hundreds of scholarly articles, book chapters, and reference essays. He also serves as the series editor for the long-running scholarly book anthology on the American presidency published by State University of New York, and as the editor of 2 popular multi-volume encyclopedia sets, The American Presidents and American First Ladies. These are currently in their 4th and 3rd editions, respectively. So let me find our guest here and unpin myself. And let's see, why am I seeing weird things? All right. I'm going to add a pen and remove myself and turn the screen over to our guest author.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kelly. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I happen to be a big fan of Richmond, love the city, one of my favorite cities. I was just there 1 month ago and try to get to Richmond every year. Love the museum district, and I'm a big fan of this Civil War Museum. In fact, when I was there a month ago, I visited. I always visit when I'm in Richmond. Love walking around by the James River. It's a very pedestrian-friendly city, a lot of great restaurants. And I went to college at Virginia Tech, so I've been going there. 59 years old now, so do the math. I've been coming to Richmond for a long time. So I love the museum. Okay, I'm gonna share screen and then we'll jump into this. Here we are, and there. Everybody see that okay? Kelly, thumbs up. Looks good. Okay, Kevin, thank you. Trudy, thanks. Okay, cool. All right, so this is a new book of mine. It's number, I think, 46, just came out. Hot off the presses, still has the new car smell. When I became a professor 30 years ago, I didn't want to be a very narrow historian that only wrote on one president or one decade or one war or one battle. I love so much of American history that I made a list of all the the things I wanted to write about. So I have a book on George Washington, a book on Lincoln, a book on my hero Harry Truman, a book on the Holocaust, World War II, the Revolutionary War, and so on. But the Civil War has always been on my list for 30 years, quite frankly, to write a book on the Civil War. And now I'm working on a second book on the Civil War. But I couldn't think of what there was to write about that hasn't been written about so extensively. You know, we are fortunate that we've had some great Civil War historians over the last several decades, and entire forests have been felled to fill the pages of the books. So really, for 30 years, I've been trying to think of a topic that I felt is underappreciated, but yet very important and intriguing. And finally, this kind of I stumbled across the Libby prison, which was in Richmond, right on the Tobacco Row there, right along the James River. It was a notorious and wretched prison right in Richmond. And of course, with Richmond being the Confederate capital, it took on even more importance and meaning. Montgomery, Alabama, as you all know, is the original capital of the Confederacy. However, Montgomery was very isolated whereas Richmond had several railways bisected Richmond, a major waterway, the James, major highways. And of course, Richmond was a lot closer to the fighting, which much of it took place in Virginia and Maryland. So the Confederate capital was moved to a much more appropriate city of Richmond. So the fact that this prison was there took on meaning. Also, Libby was for high-ranking Union officers. So we all know about some atrocious prisons, which we'll talk about. Elmira in New York, Andersonville in Georgia. Richmond was also home to one of the worst prisons in American history, quite frankly, and that was Belle Isle, which is the little island right there off the Tobacco Row. Not a prison per se, just a stockade. And people were just piled up there and exposed to the elements. So the death toll was quite atrocious. Libby was reserved for political prisoners, disloyal Southerners and traitors, and high-ranking Union officers. And it was also used for propaganda. And as I'll say in a moment, it was used as something of a zoo. It was nicknamed by some of the prisoners the Libby Zoo. And of course, the largest prison break in American history occurs from that prison. So for all these reasons, it's a fascinating story, and let's jump into it. So first off, if you're like me, you love prison escape books and movies, right? Everybody does. I just made a list of some of my favorite ones. I'm a big fan of Papillon. Loved Steve McQueen and Dustin Hoffman. The Count of Monte Cristo is one of my favorite books of all time, and the movie versions were quite good. Escape from Alcatraz was really compelling. Shawshank Redemption, also one of my favorite books and movies. So we're all enamored with prison escape stories, but especially when it's from a prison that's said to be escape-proof. That makes it all the better. And Libby was one of those prisons. It makes it even more compelling when it is a notorious prison that's used for horrific and inhumane purposes. So some of the most famous prison escapes in history, I just put a 5 up here. Father Gerard, if anybody's familiar with this story, this is from the Elizabethan era in England, late 1590s. This is when England, as well as some other parts of Europe, were wrestling with these Catholic versus Protestant conflict. England was back and forth between Protestant and Catholic. It went Protestant. So Catholics were being persecuted. Father Gerard was not only a Catholic priest, he was very outspoken, very political, very popular. So he was captured and arrested and put in the Tower of London, right by the Thames. And he was in there for 8 years and was beaten, tortured brutally. They burned him, they broke his hands, just horrific. But I'll be darned if he doesn't escape. The guards ended up falling under his spell and liking him. So there's a rope from the Tower of London across the river for him to shimmy down with broken hands. I don't know how he did it. He told the guards, he said, listen, when I escape, you're going to be complicit. They're going to come after you. They're going to think you helped me. So he actually talked the guards into escaping with him. Happy to say he was not caught, and he goes out and continues his political and religious work. Of course, Napoleon's escape from Elba is one of the most famous, when the emperor was finally captured after running amok in Europe. Only Napoleon would do this. He negotiated his conditions. He wanted his own island and wanted to be emperor of the island. So he was. And what does Napoleon do while he's at Elba? He organizes a navy, and they build ships. He trains sailors. He builds roads, organizes a professional civil service. Is improving the quality of life on the island. And what did he do with that navy? Well, he had them steal British uniforms, create British insignia, decorated one of the ships to look like a British warship, and sailed away. That was his escape. And he returns to power for 100 days until he's again captured, and that's the end of him. That's where we get the whole notion of the first 100 days for leaders like presidents. John Dillinger, you're looking at him on the left, probably the most wanted man in American history. At one point, he escaped from a jail in Indiana by making a fake pistol and using shoe polish to make it black. Now, most people, when you're the most wanted man and you escape from prison, you go into hiding. Not Dillinger. He couldn't help himself. He went on a murder and crime spree, was eventually caught and killed. Stalag Luft 3, y'all remember the movie The Great Escape? Everybody remember that one? A true story, what Roger Bushnell, the British officer, dug 3 tunnels out of a Nazi prison camp and 70 some men escaped. Tragically, all but 3 were captured. Only 3 made it away. The Nazis ended up killing the rest. But long before that tunnel escape was the one we're going to talk about today, which was actually much bigger. And of course, the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris from the photo there in the middle, Alcatraz. And what made that story all the more compelling, everybody, you know the story. The bodies were never captured, right? They tunneled out, made a raft out of life jackets. Bodies were never recovered. Did they drown? Did they make it? Even the FBI did an investigation and it was inconclusive. So I'm a sucker for those prison break stories from escape-proof prisons. So the Civil War. You know, your museum is one of my favorites, and you do a wonderful job of telling the story of the Civil War, as do so many great historians in other museums. But one aspect of the Civil War that we don't know a lot about are the prisoners of war. So that's what we're here to talk about. So just to give you some sense, here's the vitals. 620,000 deaths during the Civil War. Think about that, everybody. That's more than World War I and World War II combined. America's bloodiest war. 2% of the population. So if you extrapolate that today, if we lost 2% of our population in war, that would be millions of people, just to give you some sense of how pervasive this was. A number of people, including myself, have long written that the number of casualties and the deaths were so extensive that every town, every family lost a son, a brother, a father during this conflict. Over 51,000 casualties just at Gettysburg, a 3-day battle in early July of 1863. So do the math on that per day. I mean, atrocious. Another way to look at it, 3 southern states and 4 northern states, and I put them there. My adopted Virginia for a few years in my home state of Pennsylvania. Each of these 7 states lost over 30,000 of their own residents in the Civil War. So that's pretty extensive. Likewise, over 30,000 Black troops perished. Everybody's familiar with the Massachusetts 54th, probably one of the first and most celebrated all-Black units. The movie was, what was it, Glory, with Denzel Washington, Matthew Broderick, and Morgan Freeman, and reasonably accurate, by the way. Something that is true, I've written a book on the War of 1812, I've written a book on the Revolutionary War, I've written a lot on military history. It was certainly true even through the Civil War. More men died of disease than during combat. Also, the number of men that died from heat strokes. I just finished a book on the British burning the capital city, Washington, D.C. on August 24th, 1814. And one of the officers was talking about, as they were marching into Washington, and he looked behind him, there was this long red line of thousands of British soldiers, but behind it on either side of the road were dozens, if not hundreds of men that just fell over from heat stroke. Imagine wearing a wool uniform. You have a small canteen of putrid water. And of course, the British were not used to the heat and humidity. I love Washington, D.C., my favorite city in the United States, Richmond in the top list. But Washington, as you know, in the summers is unbelievably hot and humid. I'm here in South Florida right now in Palm Beach County. And I tell you, I take Palm Beach County over Washington, D.C. in the summers. I think Washington, D.C. is even more humid, even though I taught at Georgetown and love the city. So more men died of disease. Of course, medicine at the time. You were lucky if you did not get medical treatment. Medical treatment is often what killed the soldiers. I put the list of deaths during wars there at the bottom of the screen, just to show you the extensiveness of the loss in the Civil War, unlike anything we've ever experienced. What's also interesting, more Americans died in prisons during the Civil War than died in Vietnam, Korea. The more died in prisons during the Civil War than all those other 1700s and 1800s, 18th and 19th century wars put together, cumulative. So that gives you some sense of the prisons. I've referred to the prisons during the war as charnel houses. This is an actual photograph from a Union prisoner at Andersonville. You've all probably seen this. This is an iconic and disturbing image from American history. Charnel houses, indeed, everyone, Over 400,000 American soldiers were imprisoned during the Civil War. Over 56,000 died in prison. That's a shocking number, more than the men that we lost in Korea. Why were the numbers so shockingly high? Here's why. Naivete. The North and the South, the Union and Confederacy, did not believe that the war would take so long. There were a number of reports in newspapers in both the North and in Richmond. Richmond had at any one time around 4 newspapers being published during the Civil War, sometimes more, sometimes less. They came and went, but 4, kind of an average. Richmond newspapers, Northern newspapers, New York newspapers said the war will last 1 month. That's it. Even Lincoln thought 3 months max. The Union had a 3-month, a 90-day enlistment. They thought the war would end by then. The North believed the war would end quickly because it had the advantage of what I call the 3 M's: more men, more money, more manufacturing. Also with Operation Anaconda, right? The North encircled the South, blockaded the ports. With Southern ports blockaded, it not only limits the Confederacy's ability to move troops by water, but more importantly, to trade. The Confederacy was not able to ship its rich stores of tobacco, cotton, and agricultural products to places like England and France. So it was starved of money. So the North thought that with more men, money, and manufacturing, the war would last a month. The South also said the war would last a month. Some Southern generals and newspapers said it's only a matter of our Southern boys marching north, and that's all she wrote. The North will surrender as soon as they see us. Both sides felt they had the advantage. The South felt they had the advantage of better generals, which they certainly did. The South also said they had more of a fighting spirit, so the war will end in a month. Therefore, no one was prepared for the multiple-year bloodbath that was the Civil War. The North and South did not have prisons prepared. They did not have trained prison guards. They did not have trained prison wardens. They did not have additional spaces, warehouses, barns, and other things prepared for the overflow. And also, importantly and tragically, they did not have medicine, food, blankets, and other things prepared. So that explains the high death toll during the war. Here's I put an image of Andersonville just because it's so well known. 13,000 men die in a year in Andersonville. You can see from that picture above and the recreation below, it wasn't a prison. It was a stockade suitable for cattle. Men were out in the open. It was so bad at Andersonville, there was a small creek that went through it, and the men were so weak, so skinny, it was so overcrowded, so malnourished, that when there was a rainstorm and the creek overflowed, many men drowned because they were too weak to even hold their head up or stand up. That gives you just some sense of the conditions. So here's our topic today. There's Libby Prison. Right there, not far, I walked from your museum, Kelly, the wonderful museum. I walk back and forth from there to the site of Libby when I'm in a town, right there along the James River and the canal, right along the legendary Tobacco Row. So it was called Libby because if you look closely at the photo I put up there, right smack in the epicenter, the middle of the photo, there's a little white sign, a horizontal sign. It said Libby and Sons, Libby and Sons. That was the business that was at this warehouse before it became a prison. They never took the sign down, so it was known as Libby. The technical name was Confederate Military Prison, very generic, Confederate Military Prison. Everybody knew it as Libby. Newspapers knew it as Libby. Libby was celebrated throughout Dixie, and it was bemoaned throughout the North. Libby was quite famous. There were a number of stories of Union soldiers sitting around a campfire at night that would say, "Oh, if we're captured, are we going to Libby?" So Libby took on a reputation, a life of its own. So the nicknames, Libby had a number of nicknames, as wretched prisons do. Here, 3 of the most common. It was called the Bastille of the Confederacy, to give you some sense of how significant it was to the Confederacy. It was called the Castle of Despair and Rat Hell. The latter nickname came from all the rats in the basement, the dungeon. Soldiers that were in the dungeon in the basement said that it was almost impossible to walk without stepping on multiple rats. It was basically the floor was covered with rats. When the men were tunneling out of the prison, they said rats ran over them all night long in the tunnel. And there were so many, and the tunnel was so narrow, they couldn't defend themselves from the rats. So it was known appropriately as rat hell. If you look at the prison there, you can see later, I'll show you a photo. The bottom half of the prison would later be painted white to make it even more escape proof. The warden, Thomas Turner, he had the lower half of it painted white. So if any prisoner was sneaking out at night, their shadow would be silhouetted against the white mark. The tents you see, those are for the guards. There was a room on the first floor for the guards, but also they needed more guards because the prison became overcrowded and took on more important purposes. So that was for the guards. Here we go. So the history of it, there's a view of Libby Prison before it was painted white at the bottom from the canal and from the James River. So it was built by a Richmond resident named John Enders, who built it from 1845 to 1852. Enders wanted to build 3 warehouses. You can see from the screen here that there are 3 warehouses connected. The warehouses were going to be for tobacco. So right along the James River. So all the boats that would pull up there could unload all the tobacco from the warehouses. And that made a lot of sense. In 1852, when Enders was finishing construction, he was up on the roof on a ladder. The ladder broke and he fell 4 stories to his death. Right when it was completed. The ownership of the Libby warehouse, the warehouses, the tobacco warehouses, it wasn't called Libby yet, went to Enders's daughter's husband. He then dies in mysterious circumstances. Then it goes to one of his other relatives who dies. So eventually this warehouse, it becomes known as being haunted. It was cursed. So what a perfect facility for a wretched prison. It's said to be haunted or cursed. I put the directions there. It's on the southeast corner of 20th and Carey Streets. Those of you that are from Richmond, down by the water where the flood wall is and where a lot of folks walk their dog. Every time I've been there, there's someone walking their dog or jogging. Now, Luther and George Libby. So since the warehouses have the reputation of being cursed or haunted, nobody wanted them. So they sold them, or rented them, I should say, to a fellow from Maine who wasn't familiar with it. His name was Luther Libby and his son, George. Luther Libby was a chandler. Chandlers are folks that are provide a warehouse and supplies for ships. So ships would pull up to Luther Libby's chandlery, and he would provide them with sails, tar, food, nails, hammers, whatever ships would need. So that was Luther Libby's warehouse. When the Civil War began, of course, the Battle of Bull Run, if you're from the north, the Battle of Manassas, if you're from the south, it had 2 different names. Right away in the war, it was apparent that they were going to need prisons. They had hundreds and hundreds of prisoners. So the South confiscated Libby's warehouse, gave him about a day or 2 to escape, to turn it over. They ultimately would arrest him and put him in jail. So here's the inside of Libby Prison, circa March 1862. It had 8 large rooms. Each one was about 105 feet long by about 45 feet wide. Low ceiling, as you can see here. Open windows. So if you were stuck by a window, the cold air, the snow, the rain, or the heat in the summer would be there to plague people. There's no beds. There's no place to sit down. No nothing. Just open warehouses. So it would make for a terrible prison. So Libby became the central receiving area for all prisoners. One of the ironies of the Confederacy, as many of you might be aware, is the Confederacy claimed it wanted states' rights. It was persecuted by the Northern government, which it really wasn't. But the Confederacy became excessively centralized. Jefferson Davis functioned almost as a dictator. And even the prison system, everything in Southern life was centralized. So anyone who was being arrested would be marched, brought by wagons, brought by boat, or oftentimes by train to Richmond. They'd be paraded down the main street in Richmond, and they were all taken to Libby. So Libby is where you'd be processed. If you're a soldier, private, you'd be then sent over to Belle Isle or some other place. If you're a colonel or a general, you stayed in Libby. When you first came into Libby, if you were an officer, they would rob you. Your coat and your boots were stolen. The South, as you're all probably aware, shortly into the war was running out of clothing, running out of food, running out of medicine. Many Southern soldiers froze to death in the winter. Many starved to death. Many were shoeless. So Northern merchants were producing a high quality boots, jackets, much higher quality than in the South. So the guards, the wardens stole all their boots, their shirts, their jackets, their clothing. Many of them were half naked, and some of them kept them for themselves or sold them on the black market in Richmond. Starvation, just to make the prisoners know who was in charge and who was the boss. The warden, Thomas Turner, and the deputy warden, Dick Turner, no relation, just coincidence. They wouldn't feed anybody for the first 24 hours you were in the prison, just to make a point. And beatings were very common, especially if you were a famous general or famous colonel. There was a colonel named Abel Strait. We'll talk about him in a moment. He was Dutch from Indiana. He was a raider. Those of you that are Civil War buffs may know John Hunt Morgan, a very dashing and effective Southern officer who went up through from Kentucky to Ohio to Indiana. He was a raider, these lightning strikes, and he would go and on horseback, and he was almost a ghost-like figure. He gets captured and escapes as well. So Morgan was a very dashing, beloved figure in the South, very effective, a hell of an officer. The North was scared to death of him. The North had their version of Morgan. His name was Strait, and Strait did his raids in the South. But Strait's raids were not lightning strikes like Morgan, come and go like a ghost. Strait had donkeys, not horses, so it was slow. What he did is he used the rough terrain in the Appalachians, the Smokies, so he would disrupt supply lines there. Strait was, definitely a public enemy in the South. So when he was captured, he was beaten savagely. There was a sign when you entered, all hope abandoned, ye who enter here, from Dante's Inferno. It reminded me of, I've written on the Holocaust, and you're all probably aware that a lot of the concentration camps had very morbid and haunting messages for folks who checked in and often didn't check out. So here's the two wardens in Libby. The big guy on the left with the beard is Dick Turner. He's the deputy warden. And a very little guy, looks like a kid, on the right is Thomas Turner. He's the warden. The officers inside Libby prison were scared to death of these two guys. Dick Turner was a big man who physically would just beat the prisoners. So he was a tough guy, and he would often drag them down into the dungeon and put them in solitary confinement in the dungeon. Solitary in the dungeon was not a pleasant experience. First off, you're in pitch black 24 hours a day. Secondly, it's filled with rats. Thirdly, you didn't eat. And fourth, maybe the worst, was there was a sewage system that ran along the dungeon and poured into the canal. So a lot of times it overflowed, so you were treading on raw sewage. At the least, at the best, you were smelling it. So that was Dick Turner on the left with the beard, the big guy. Thomas Turner on the right was a small, weak, frail fellow, but the prisoners were more afraid of him because he had a cruel and evil disposition, and absolutely inhumane. I wrote on the screen here, here's a couple quotes about him from some of the prisoners. You can see entirely devoid of humanity, vicious, sinister. I found hundreds of quotes similar to this that I put a few of them in the book and a few on the screen for you. There's Dick Turner, the big guy, deputy warden down in the dungeon. So these are the cells where you were locked away in solitary. It's from that dungeon underneath the prison in pitch black that the biggest escape in American history takes place when they came out from that dungeon. Two of the things that I found most appalling in the prison were, I have on the screen here, propaganda and the Libby Zoo. Now, the North had some tough prisons and bad prisons. Elmira in New York, diseases tore through that prison and killed countless hundreds, if not thousands, of Confederate prisoners. Libby did not have the death toll of Belle Isle, that open area in Richmond, or Andersonville. So it wasn't as bad in terms of the death toll, but because it was in Richmond, because it was on Tobacco Row, because of the high-ranking officers, it was used as propaganda. The Turners, on a regular basis, doled out beatings to the prisoners. They had something called the Libby lottery. They would get, let's say maybe today it's majors or colonels. They would get a couple of colonels, and you had to pool straws. Whomever got the short straw, they would be killed. So it was all a form of terror, psychological terror. They would stop prisoner exchanges. They would not feed the men for a day. They would harass them in the middle of the night and call roll calls at all hours. So psychological warfare, you might say. But here's where the propaganda comes in. The Confederacy did not try to keep this cruel treatment a secret. No, on the contrary, they broadcast it. They announced it, if you will. It was in newspapers. They boasted of it, hoping that Union officers would be so afraid of going to Richmond, going to Libby, that they wouldn't pick up arms against them. So it was used for propaganda purposes. It was also used for propaganda in the South. What they would do is they would announce, 200 prisoners came in today. Another 5 died last night. We must be winning the war. Obviously, the Confederacy, after the first, 2 years, was losing the war, and the writing was on the wall, clearly by, 64, if not late 63. But what the Confederacy did was they would say, look at how many prisoners we're bringing into Libby. Look how many died last night. So they were trying to imbue Southerners with a sense of confidence that we're going to win this war. The Libby Zoo. So they gave tours of Libby in those big open rooms. They would march residents from Richmond and prominent Southerners through, and they would point out like at a zoo, like you would say, here's the giraffe exhibit, here's the baboon exhibit, here's the elephant exhibit. They would say, oh, there's Colonel Strait, the famous Union raider. He's lying on his side, half dead. Not so tough now, is he? That kind of a thing. People threw garbage on the Union prisoners. So they used it as a zoo. So not only was it a horrific experience to be in there, but emotionally and psychologically, the men were humiliated by being used like as if they were a zoo. There was a man that was billed as the tallest Union soldier. He was 6'9", and he was a prisoner in there. Remember, in the 1860s, people are a lot smaller than they are today. Lincoln at 6'4" would be equivalent to being, 6'8", 6'9" today. So people were a lot smaller. So this guy was unbelievably tall, and people lined up to get a tour of the zoo and see the freakish tallest Union officer. This poor guy was humiliated. How did the soldiers, you can see the picture there, how they painted it white at the bottom. So this is in the second half of the Civil War. Civil War, everybody, 1861 to 65. So you can see the guards all around the area. How did the soldiers cope with these difficult conditions? Not being fed, being beaten, the psychological warfare. In the winter, there's open windows. They would freeze to death. They often found soldiers in the morning that were forced to sleep near the window. They find them frozen stiff. What they did, because it was so crowded, there would be 1,000 men, 1,200 men at a time, hundreds in each room. They would be piled up on top of one another. So the only way they could sleep without being piled up on top of one another, and they didn't have beds, they had no pillows for their head, no bedding, they're down to skin and bones. So if they just slept on one side, they would have welts and bruises all over that side. So what they did, just like newlyweds, they would spoon. All the men would line up in a 100-foot row of spooning together, and they'd all spoon on their left. Every hour, the commanding officer would say, okay, attention, 1, 2, 3, spoon right. And they would all roll over. That way their left side wouldn't get too sore, or it kept their blood flowing during the cold nights. So the men would, every hour, would roll over, and they all spoon together to try to keep warm. So one of the ways the men survived was they created a lyceum. So Socrates' best student was Plato, who creates the academy, which is sort of the first university, you might say, in Western civilization. Plato's student is Aristotle, who disagrees with him and creates the Lyceum. So the men inside Libby there were Ivy League professors, there were really educated generals, the best of the best. So they created their own Lyceum inside Libby to cope with the conditions. Although because they were tormented by so many pests, they called it not the Lyceum, they called it the Lyceum. They said the best exercise in Libby was scratching from just having just covered in lice. That was how you got exercise, you scratched. So what did they do with the Lyceum? One, they published a newspaper. It was called the Libby Chronicle. And there was a Canadian fellow named Beaudry who moved to Maine, who was the publisher of it. He lives through this and saved copies of the newspaper and reprinted them so it exists for history. They wrote jokes, they wrote news, they made poems, things of that effect. They put on holiday musicals. They just couldn't sing very loud. They had to sing very quietly, because if they sang loudly or if they laughed at the plays, the guards would come in and the guards would say, "Who's singing?" And all 1,200 men would raise their hands, and then they would arbitrarily beat a few of them. There were several professional actors, professional singers. They had multiple musical or vocal ensembles inside courses inside Libby. They also held classes. They had classes in theology, in military strategy and warfare, classes in history, multiple languages, Spanish, French, German. There were many Europeans who fought and were inside of Libby, several Hungarians, by the way. They thought that the Confederacy's treatment of slaves was similar to their own oppression by aristocrats in Europe. So a lot of Europeans came over and fought on behalf of the Union and were in prison in Libby. So they had all sorts of classes. One of the favorite was pranking the guards. The men would all get a hard piece of bread, hard tack, you bite into it, you lose a tooth, or an old shoe or a rock or a piece of wood. And when the guards would come in, everybody would throw it at them at once. They knew the guards would beat a few of them, but it was worth doing that. They also loved to prank the guards during the roll call. If they were doing the roll call, the men would be lined up, the guards would be counting 572, 573, 574, and all the prisoners would yell out 536, 671, 823, and then the guards would forget and lose their place and have to start over again. Or what you would do is when they would call out someone's name, of course, everybody said present. Somebody would take their hat off and hold it on their hand next to them, so it would be their head in a hat. The guard would double count, and they would count more men than there were in there. Now, whenever they pranked the guards, they were beaten, but it was worth it to beat them. Okay, so December of 1863 and January of 1864, we're moving into the last year of the war. The conditions deteriorate. The South has run out of food. The South has run out of medicine. The South has run out of blankets, clothing. There's no more prisoner exchanges. The soldiers, the prisoners inside Libby aren't eating every day. If you ate every meal you got, 2 meals a day, you were barely getting enough food to stay alive. So when they would not feed you every other day, the men were not getting the number of calories they needed to stay alive. Therefore, they knew, December and January of 64, they knew that they were going to die. It wasn't if, it was when. There was no more exchange, no more boxed lunches, no more blankets. It was an exceptionally cold winter. Fortunately, the newspapers and a number of folks wrote the weather in January and February in Richmond, some of the coldest weeks in Richmond's history. So the men knew it wasn't if, but when they were going to die. The person you're looking at on the left is Nathan Bedford Forrest, one of the nastiest generals of the war. He would go on to found the KKK when the war was over. Forrest is infamous for the scene on the right. That's the Fort Pillow Massacre. When the North put black soldiers in uniform, Forrest announced he will no longer take prisoners. He'll kill everybody in cold blood. They started beating and killing people in the prisons too. So Northern prisoners in Libby knew they were going to die. That's when they developed the plan. The plan was to tunnel out. The initial plan was developed by a fellow named Colonel Thomas Rose. I have his name on the left. Rose was from Pennsylvania. He was from near Philadelphia, Quaker country. He was an abolitionist. And his family were school teachers. He wants to go out on his own as a school teacher. He moves to Pittsburgh in the western part of the state, becomes a principal. Rose is a physically big, powerful guy with a big beard. But paradoxically, he's quiet and humble. When the war starts, he enlists in the war. He rises up all the way to colonel very quickly. Rose is not a loud man, but he leads by example. We have many cases where Rose is, for example, at Chickamauga, the Battle of Chickamauga, fought in the South. The Union line is being busted by the Confederacy. Rose personally runs, draws a sword, and in hand-to-hand is trying to fill the line. So he was a man that led from the front. He's captured at Chickamauga. He's put on a train at night. It's raining. The men are open. It's raining on them in an open train car. Rose figures because of the weather in the night, it's his chance to escape. He jumps off the train on his way to Richmond, lands wrong and breaks his foot and ankle. He runs on a broken foot and ankle and eludes the Southern guards for hours. When they catch him, they beat him savagely with the butts of their guns. They put him back on the train and bring him to Richmond. When they would bring everybody to Richmond to be processed at Libby, there was a procedure. You had to walk down from the train depot to Libby down the main street. And when you're going down the main street, people would throw food on you, feces. People would run up and sucker punch people, yell, spit on them. The men were scared to death that they were going to be killed on this walk. Plus, they knew they were going to Libby. Many of them said that they were worried about Rose. He walked in front of them, like a zombie, basically. People would spit on him. He didn't even wipe it off. He wasn't afraid. He didn't blink. And on a broken foot, he walked gradually in front of everyone. Why? He was counting the number of steps. He was memorizing the streets. He was looking for guards. He was already planning his escape. When he arrives at Libby, he's robbed, stripped, but he's beaten again because he's this famous Union officer who tried to escape. As he's being beaten, the men said he didn't flinch. Why? He's memorizing the prison. He's looking at the guards. He's figuring everybody out. He's going to escape. So on a rainy night, the roof was leaking. So the guards put up scaffolding to repair the roof. It started pouring and lightning. So the guards ran inside. So Rose goes over to the window. He's a big, strong man. So he's going to try to pry the bars open and jump out onto the scaffolding, climb down and escape. He can't get the bars open. But when he's trying, there's a lightning bolt that illuminates him. And right there beside him is another face. He and the other guy gasp. It turns out to be Andrew Hamilton, who was a major from Kentucky. He was a mounted cavalry officer. He was part of the Union that captured the famous John Hunt Morgan. So Hamilton and Rose had the exact same idea to escape at the exact same time. They realized they couldn't, so they went back to bed. A few days later, Rose gets into the dungeon. He's a big, tough guy. So what he does is he busts the door open and goes into the dungeon. He's feeling along the wall to try to find where the sewer was. Rose looks out the window and realizes rats run in and out of that sewer. So the sewer must go from the dungeon into the canal. If he can get in the sewer and swim through the sewer, he could drop down into the James River Canal and escape. So he's feeling along the wall, stepping on rats. All of a sudden, he bumps into someone and screams. The other person screams, "It's Hamilton again." Lightning struck twice. They both met at the same time. So they shook hands and agreed they would escape together. The plan was they were going to dig a tunnel out of the dungeon into the sewer. That was their plan. The problem was the guards realized somebody busted the door into the dungeon, so they put a double bolt on it. So they needed a new way to get into the dungeon. The new way was from a fireplace. Hamilton found a fireplace in the kitchen that was never used. In front of it were several big, large black cauldrons that they cooked the food in. So what they would do is sneak down there at night. Rose, as a big, strong fellow, would push the cauldrons away, and with a little jackknife, they would scrape the mortar off the bricks and disassemble the fireplace brick by brick and start digging a hole down into the dungeon from the fireplace. Each morning, they had to replace all the bricks and mortar. Rose had to push the cauldrons back and sneak upstairs before roll call. So that's the way they're going to escape. So they had a couple of folks that helped them. You can see Colonel Rose, Major Hamilton. Abel Strait helped them. He was the big burly Dutchman I told you about, who was a raider who was regularly beaten. There was a guy named Frederick Bartleson who helped him. Bartleson lost an arm during the war, such a hero that he continued to fight and stayed in uniform. He couldn't dig and tunnel out and couldn't climb down the shaft because he only had one arm. Bartleson was a poet. So what he did was he wrote poetry every day for the men to inspire them. He also, when they were allowed to send letters, he wrote poetry for their wives, their mothers, their family, their loved ones. So Bartleson was a poet who inspired everybody. He was from Illinois. Colonel Cavada, Kelly, that's the one we were talking about beforehand. When you all go to your lovely museum in Richmond, right when you pay at the desk on the right and you go to walk into the entrance, there's the first picture above your head is of a dashing fellow that looks like a cavalier or a musketeer. That's Cavada. He was from Cuba. His father was Cuban, mother was from Philadelphia. He was a balloon officer who would fly in a hot air balloon above the battlefield and report where the Confederates were. He was captured at Gettysburg when the Confederate soldiers overran his balloon site, and he was stuck in Libby as well. So they dug a tunnel. This is obviously not during the Civil War. This is obviously not them. There were no photographs taken of the tunnel. But from the descriptions, this is the closest I could find. So I spent off and on for probably a year. I would look at pictures to try to find one that reminded me of it. This is the best I got. Rock and dirt, only wide enough for your shoulders. Big men like Rose would get stuck in the tunnel. The tunnel would be only about 18 inches wide, 2 feet at the max, and it's the same as at the height. So if you went into the tunnel, you had to back out and pray that you didn't get stuck. One of the things they did, when you got deep into the tunnel, Rose passed out from a lack of oxygen, or his candle would go out. They would steal candles. So Hamilton, who was kind of like a MacGyver figure, you all know MacGyver, right, everyone? My students have no idea who he is. So, but my students have never dialed a phone. They've never rolled down a car window. They've never turned a channel on a TV. They don't know what rabbit ears are. They've never heard of Johnny Carson, right? And they didn't know there used to be a milkman and an iceman. So at any rate, what Hamilton did was he got a straw hat and put sticks in it and weaved it together so he could stand by the entrance of the tunnel and fan air in so Rose wouldn't pass out or the candle wouldn't go out. He also tied a rope from a clothesline that he stole around Rose's ankle. And when Rose passed out, Hamilton could pull him out and try to resuscitate him. Rose would have to dig and then back out with all the dirt and rocks. So Hamilton stole a spittoon and more rope, and he created a pulley system. So Rose would fill up the spittoon, yank on the rope, Hamilton would pull it out and empty it, Rose would pull it back in. So it was a very efficient system. So next slide, there we go. A couple of things happened. One day when Rose dug into the sewer, right when they got into the sewer, it collapsed and Rose almost drowned in raw sewage, an unimaginable death. They had an unexpected roll call. The fellow you're looking at the right, he was a clerk. His name was Erastus Ross, and he called the roll calls. One night they called a roll call, and there was a man down in the dungeon helping them to dig named Captain Johnston. I have him here. He couldn't get upstairs in time, so he was stuck in the dungeon. Now, if he showed up upstairs in a day or two, they would know he was trying to escape and he was in the dungeon. So he had to stay in the dungeon all day, all night, 24/7, in sewage, pitch black, and among the rats. He called it his purgatory. There was a huge bale of a pile of straw that used to be used to fill the bedding for the guards. It was no longer used. The only thing that the prisoner said, Rose said that the straw was used for rats to sleep in. So one night, Johnston's down in the basement by himself, which means Rose and Hamilton had to sneak food down to him every night. Now, Rose and Hamilton didn't have enough to stay alive, so now they're splitting their food with Johnston. Johnston's stuck in the basement. While he's down there one night, the door opens up and Confederate soldiers come in. He's going to be caught. He dives under the pile of straw. The problem is with the straw, he's going to sneeze. He's holding his nose. He feels a sneeze. The guards start stabbing into the straw with bayonets. Rats are running over him and he can't say a peep, can't make a move or noise. All of a sudden the door opens up again and they bring a bloodhound in. He's done. The bloodhound races straight to the straw. But when it gets there, a rat runs out and the bloodhound, the dog, chases the rat. The guards say, it's just rats, and they leave, and he lived. Anyway, I'm going to move forward. There was a famous spy in Richmond who was helping these prisoners. The spy was getting letters from Grant and General Benjamin Butler. The spy was sneaking food into the prison. No one knew who the spy was. The delicious irony, it turned out to be a woman. It turned out to be Elizabeth Van Lew, L-E-W. They called her Crazy Bet. There she is on the left. Her father, who had passed away, was probably the wealthiest resident of Richmond. Do you all know where Church Street is? Church Hill up on top of Richmond, overlooking the city. That's where her home was. It was torn down around 1901. There she is as an older woman sitting out in front of her home. So she was a spy. She was given a codex by Union generals to write in code. She would write in lemon juice, and when you heat it up and put milk on it, it would appear. So she would write with invisible ink. The guards and the wardens were starving. She was a good cook. She would bring down fresh baked food and say to the guards, if you let me give some to the prisoners, I'll give some to you. They were willing to say yes because they were starving. She was a good cook. Well, she would give the prisoners eggs, but she would hollow out the bottom row of eggs and put notes in there about how to escape and when to escape. She also had a secret compartment under one of her bowls. And once when a Confederate guard grabbed her bowl, it burned his hand, so he gave it back to her. So that's Crazy Bet, who helped the prisoners to escape. There's in the room on the right, that's an actual photo of a hidden room she had in her house where she hid Union prisoners. On the left is an artist's imagined view of her hiding Union prisoners. So the men escaped. For over 38 days, they dug a tunnel. It was finally ready for escape on February 9th, 1864. So that's when the big escape takes place. Rose had 3 5-man crews digging. The tunnel was 53 feet long, but well over 60 feet because it was a bit curved. They dug it with just a knife, broken shovel. They worked all night long, which meant they couldn't sleep. So these men were dying of starvation and a lack of sleep. It was a race against time. So on February 9th is when they escaped. 109 men escaped. 48 would be recaptured. 59 made it. Most lived. 2 died. What's neat is the route they took today is your wonderful Virginia Capitol Trail, which I quite love. I've ridden the bike on part of it. So from Richmond, you follow the James River all the way down to Williamsburg. The Yankees had taken Williamsburg, and the intelligence was brought in by Crazy Bet, the spy. She played like she was crazy so that the Confederates wouldn't suspect her. Plus, who would expect an older woman at the time? So that's when the men escaped. The first 2 out were Rose and Hamilton. And then 2 by 2 by 2, they ran. Hamilton would end up being one of the first to reach Williamsburg. Took him about a week. Rose ran and ran, hid by day, ran by night. It was the largest manhunt in American history at the time. The largest manhunt would occur 1 year later when Booth shot Lincoln. If Booth had not shot Lincoln, we would have remembered this manhunt. Why? It was Union generals and colonels who escaped from Richmond, from an escape-proof prison from the Confederate capital. So there was a desperate manhunt for them. So the problem was those who were stuck back in Richmond at Libby, those who were captured were beaten. They were stuck in the prison. Turner, the warden, threatened to kill everyone. He starved everyone and beat everyone. So the folks like Hamilton that made it noted that everybody's going to die. So the Union mounted an effort. It was called the Kill Cavalry, named for Judson Kilpatrick. That's him on the left, an incompetent general. The Union was going to race in a lightning strike on horseback, bust open Libby prison, kill the wardens and guards. They were riding with extra horses. The men would jump on the extra horses and they would get them out of there. Unfortunately, the strategy was leaked, and the Confederates were waiting for them and slaughtered the cavalry. The man on the top right is Colonel Dahlgren. He was European. He was tall, handsome, strong, dashing. He had one leg. He continued to fight in the war with one leg. He was captured. The Confederacy dragged him and his leg up and down the street, hung him up upside down, tortured him, and left the dead corpse hanging upside down, and put up the leg as a treasure. The next day, they woke up and his body was gone. It was Crazy Bet, who snuck down at night and cut him down and buried him. And then after the war, informed the family of where he was. So the war ends in April of '65 when Davis, Lee, and others fled after Grant surrounded Petersburg and sieged and surrounded Richmond. Jeff Davis ordered that Richmond, your lovely city, be burned. There's a picture on the right of what Richmond looked like. So it was burned by the Confederacy as they left. Lincoln arrives on April 2nd. He wants to meet with Davis, Lee, and negotiate. Almost nobody's there to meet him. Secondly, he wants to go see Jefferson Davis's office at the lovely White House of the Confederacy, which I always also enjoy visiting when I'm in Richmond. Lincoln couldn't resist. His entourage goes there, and Lincoln is a big, tall man. Lincoln sits in Davis's seat and starts making fun, saying, I don't know, this is a little small for a man. It's too small for me. So he's making fun of Jeff Davis. The third reason why Lincoln wanted to go to Richmond was, yes, he went to Libby. He wanted to see Libby. When he goes there, the crowd is yelling, we will tear it down. But Lincoln says, no, leave it as a monument. He wanted people to know what happened there. Leave it as a monument. Here's the 5 men I told you about. On the left with the big beard, that's Colonel Rose, the one who planned the South, was the main digger, and got 109 men out of the prison. Rose runs for a week on a broken foot. His story's incredible. I mean, he's hiding into the water when the Confederates go by a river. He's sleeping in a log. He gets all the way to Williamsburg. There's an open field. He knows he'll be vulnerable in the open field, so he hides in the woods to look to see if there's any Confederates. He can see the Union smoke from the campfires. He can smell the bacon. He can hear the voices. Satisfied there's no Confederates in the open field, Rose runs across the field, gets halfway across, and 5 Confederate soldiers stand up from the tall grass. They were waiting there as advanced warning systems, if you will, if the Union attacked from Williamsburg. They capture Rose. Rose is in a fight with them. He beats some of them until they knock him out with the butt of the gun. They beat him savagely. So Rose has been beaten countless times. They bring him back to Libby. He's put back into Libby, where he's beaten by Dick Turner and put in solitary. Somehow Rose lives through this. He stays in uniform, rises to the rank of general, and I'm happy to tell you he lives a long life as a great American hero. On the top right, that's Hamilton, the young, dashing guy from Kentucky who was a cavalry officer, who was a MacGyver type of figure. Hamilton escapes, makes it to Williamsburg. He's the one that warns all the Union soldiers that everybody's coming. They go out on horseback and they help find over 50 of Hamilton's fellow prisoners. So Hamilton renders that great service. He goes back to Kentucky. It's difficult in the post-war years in Kentucky because part of Kentucky was Union, pro-Union, part was pro-Confederacy. Hamilton's a hero who fought for the Union, so it's not good for him. He's subject to a lot of harassment in Kentucky. He and another veteran, one night on a Saturday night, go to a saloon, and they're sitting out front on a bench, having a drink, enjoying a nice evening, telling stories about the war. A couple young ruffians show up, and they're drinking. They know it's Hamilton, and they shoot and kill him after the war. Abel Strait, that's the top left with the hat. That's the big Dutchman who was the Union raider that they beat him mercilessly. When he tried to escape, he got stuck in a tunnel like Winnie the Pooh. They had to strip him down, and there's men behind him pushing his butt and in the front pulling him. They finally got him through the tunnel. He was so weak from the beatings and being stuck, he couldn't escape. Crazy Bet saves him and hides him in her house. He eventually makes it to freedom. At bottom left, you can see he has one arm. That's Bartleson. That's the poet who wrote all the poetry to inspire the men. He lives through this somehow. And instead of going back to civilian life, he stays in uniform. In the closing days of the war, Colonel Bartleson is leading from the front and is shot and killed. Bottom right, that's Cavada. Kelly, that's your big picture hanging up above the entrance to your wonderful museum. He's the Cuban, Federico Cavada, the balloon officer at Gettysburg. Cavada somehow lives through this too. He was subject to beatings because he was an immigrant and had an accent. Some folks, are like that in our country, sadly. Cavada lives through this. He goes back to Cuba, where he becomes a general and the leader of the Cuban Revolution to fight against Spanish imperialism and colonialism. He is going to sail one night from a port in northern Cuba to Philadelphia, where his mother had been from, to get weaponry and money to help fund the revolution. Someone ratted him out. The Spanish government captures him and tortures him, all the way up to Ulysses Grant. Prominent American political figures wrote to Spain begging to save Cavada's life, but they killed him. I've been to Cuba. There are squares called Cavada Square, a Cavada Road, a Cavada Hospital. He's a great hero in Cuba today. Here's a line of one of Bartleson's poems. Every hour, the Confederate guards would yell, 4 o'clock and all is well. So one of his poems, is it so, my fellow captives sleeping, where the barred window strictest watch is keeping, dreaming of home and wife and prattling child, of the sequestered vale, the mountain wild. Tell me, when cruel morn shall break again, wilt thou repeat the sentinel's refrain, all is well. So Libby was torn down against Lincoln's wishes, loaded up on a train, brick by brick, and taken to Chicago. The train overturned and a lot of it was lost. They reloaded it and they built the Great Libby Prison War Museum in Chicago. You're looking at it. Looks like a castle, doesn't it, everybody? It was a very popular prison and Civil War museum. And for a few years, it did well. But then people stopped going to it and it went bankrupt. And what happened to the bricks and containers from Libby? They gave them out to anybody. So any farmer or person that wanted a brick. So probably today, there's historic structures all across the country built with the bricks of Libby. In your prison, in your wonderful museum, there's information on Libby. Your museum does a good job, one of the few in the world that actually tell part of Libby's story. In the Virginia Museum of History, they have the key and a window, a barred window from Libby. So both your facilities do a wonderful job. Here's the interior of that old museum from the interior of Libby. So that's what the rooms would have looked like, minus anything in them. Today, what happened to Libby is nothing there now. Do you all know where the Virginia Holocaust Museum is? Those of you that are from Richmond, that's where Libby was. Years ago, and a couple of times, I've told the folks at the Virginia Holocaust Museum, guess what? Guess what's sitting underneath your museum? The bones and the foundation of this old prison. So I think it's entirely fitting that a Holocaust museum is sitting on top of sacred ground. This is the sign. I took a picture of it, a little bigger than a license plate, right there on your flood wall in Richmond, across from the Holocaust Museum. So that's what became of Libby, a sign. Here's the barred window. It's about 4 feet high, and the key, that's from your Virginia History Museum, the Museum of History and Culture, right on Museum Row there, not far from where you all are located. Here, this is right there. I'll put that in for you, Kelly. Lincoln came to visit, and there's that lovely statue and memorial and a line from the second inaugural behind this wonderful American Civil War Museum. There's 2 famous paintings of Libby. I put them in there because I love the paintings and also because they're completely inaccurate. Look how high the ceiling is. Look, all the soldiers have their uniforms. They're all well fed. They're hanging out. They have furniture. They're just chilling, playing cards. No, they were half naked, dying on the floor, low ceiling, 10 times as many men, and didn't have the clothing. This painting I always liked. The ceiling's too high. The men are not skinny enough, but I like it because a lot of the men are not fully clothed. They don't have the uniforms. It has a biblical, emotional feel to it. So I always like that one. And closing, Libby was one of the most wretched prisons in history. It was the most high-profile prison of the Confederacy. A lot of men died and suffered in there. The story's been almost completely forgotten, yet a lot of heroes managed to escape from it. It was used for the nefarious purposes of propaganda and as a zoo. So let's heed Lincoln's words and remember this prison. That's the cover of my book that just came out. I had to put, Kelly, I hope you don't mind, a shameless plug in there for my book. It's available anywhere where books are sold. And that's the story of Libby. It's all the truth, but it's not even half of the story for you. So thanks, everybody.
And thank you so much. And I am certainly glad you made a plug for your book, and I was going to do the same because we do have the book in the shop. So if anyone wants to go to acwm.org and visit our gift shop and purchase it from there, that would be great as well.
And either way, everybody, I encourage you to visit the gift shop. It's charming. I bought T-shirts and items there myself over the years. It's a lovely gift shop, a lovely museum in a great location in Richmond. So yeah, and you can visit it online.
And as always, you all can put questions into the chat, and I think there are some coming in. And while you're kind of looking at those, I have one for you. I had never seen the picture of the dungeons and the tunnel entrance. Are those were those in the Libby Prison Museum? Is that what those photos were from?
Yeah. So you know, the museum, the prison lasted until the end of the war. Dick Turner, the big deputy warden, the Union caught him, and poetically they put him in Libby at the end of the war. Thomas Turner ran away, the warden, and ran. I mean, he fled from Mexico to England to Canada. Didn't like anywhere. Late in life, comes back to I believe Tennessee is where he died. He ran away with General Jubal Early, one of the famous Confederate generals. They hiked all the way across the Mississippi River and went down into Texas. Yeah, so photography is in during the Civil War, as you all know. There was a picture taken of where it was, the tunnel. And when they recreated the prison, they literally took the cauldrons, the bricks, and the fireplace, brick by brick. They rebuilt it in Chicago. And a handful of the former prisoners went there to consult on it. So the pictures we see are from the rebuilt Libby prison. But according to the few prisoners who went to Chicago, it was accurate, including a famous general named Neil Dow, who's a very reliable source. So yeah, thanks, Kelly.
Interesting. I had never seen those photographs before, so that was
Yeah,
fun.
they're very rare. So we got some. Here we go. Karen says her Virginia chapter of the Daughters of Union Veterans of the Civil War is called Elizabeth Van Loo chapter. Very good. Thank you, Karen. Well, I'm a big fan of Elizabeth Van Loo. My book has a lot of information on her peppered throughout the book. I did have a lot more, but I came in probably 15 to 20,000 words over what my publisher wanted. So I did have to trim some of it back. All my books come in anywhere from 10 to, my most recent one came in 32,000 words over. I tend to be very windy. But thank you, Karen. I'm a big fan of Elizabeth Van Loo. She was a hero. Grant appointed her postmaster. She was revered. She was despised in Richmond when folks found out she was the spy. People gathered outside of her mansion and threatened to burn it down. She even brought her horse inside with straw because she thought they were going to poison her horse. She marches out on the porch to people out there threatening to kill her with torches and pitchforks. And she says, if you lay one hand on me, General Grant's coming here and there's going to be hell to pay. So she stared him down. She was tough. Yeah, there's a book on Crazy Bet I would recommend to all of you. A female author. I've just forgotten her name. She and I actually spoke at a book festival together. So there is. Are
you thinking of Elizabeth Barron?
Yes, that's it. Thank you. It's a good book. She does a good job. She's a good historian. I recommend it to you. It's on Elizabeth Van Loo. Thank you, Kelly. It's a good book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Unfortunately, a lot of the prisoners wrote about her. A descendant of Paul Revere was saved by her. He later sent money to her. A lot of Union soldiers sent money and letters to Elizabeth Van Loo thanking her for saving their lives. They wrote about her. So we have a lot of sources. I found dozens of sources on her. Did Crazy Bet's name come about? years after the war, Larry. Good. So first off, in the genteel times of the 1860s, no one would expect an older woman to be the spy. Elizabeth Van Lew never married, and she was an abolitionist, so people thought she was crazy for those reasons, but she kind of played up the crazy. Because if you're a crazy older woman, they let you walk in and out of the prison. She could pass intelligence back and forth with the Union officers, so no one suspected her. So yeah, crazy came about. They referred to her as crazy during the war, and again in the immediate years after the war. She was written about. I read 4 of Richmond's newspapers for the duration of the Civil War. I read hundreds and hundreds of articles, and the newspapers gave regular reports on Elizabeth Van Lew. They would say that we suspect that she and her mother do not support our cause. So it was pretty dicey for her. Karen asked, doesn't Andersonville rank up there with Libby and horrible high-profile Southern prisons? Yeah, Andersonville was the bloodiest Southern prison, Karen, absolutely. It was the bloodiest. It was only open for about a year. So its profile was not as that of Libby, which was open for several years. Secondly, Andersonville just had anybody. Libby had high-ranking Union officers. Andersonville was in rural Georgia. Libby was in Richmond, not far from where Jeff Davis governed. So for all those reasons, Libby was more high profile. Libby was discussed in the newspapers, North and South, much more than Andersonville was. But Andersonville was far bloodier. Oh, by the way, I see Marilyn, Debbie, and Carolyn, and Willow. I see some of my buddies are here. So hi, Debbie, and hi, Marilyn, and Carolyn, and Willow. So good question, Karen. Fernando, thanks for sharing the story, including one of the Cavada brothers. Yeah, so both Cavada brothers helped support the war effort, and I'm a big fan of Colonel Cavada. The guy was an engineer, an architect, very well educated. He wrote beautifully, and his writings survive. I read his memoirs, his writings on Libby in its entirety, page by page, word by word. It's beautifully written. He was quite a courageous fellow. And of course, I'm a fan of Jose Marti, and Cavada has a bit of that Jose Marti in him. So I absolutely liked him. Thanks, Fernando. Cindy, she was my kind of gal. Oh yeah, Elizabeth Van Lew was my kind of gal too. In fact, I write a book a year, and I work on my book 365. So there's not a day that I don't read or write. I put something on paper and read something, even if I lecture on cruise ships. In fact, Debbie and Marilyn and Carolyn and Willow are all going on a cruise with me. So even when I go on a cruise, I bring papers to read or a laptop. So I work 365. So I try to churn out a book very quickly. I fell for Elizabeth Van Lew, loved her. I ended up taking about a week out of my research schedule just to dig up stuff on her. And I digressed and was just enjoying reading about her. So she actually delayed the release of my book because I liked her so much. So I'm with you, Cindy. She was my kind of gal. Where are you from in Pennsylvania? Kevin asks. Thank you, Kevin. Kevin, I'm from Hershey, Harrisburg, Chocolatetown, USA. That's why I'm so sweet. Kevin, you're from Richmond? Kevin's muted. Can you unmute him?
Yeah, he is muted. I could try to unmute him.
Or you could put it in the chat, Kevin. Yeah, I was born in Harrisburg, grew up in Hershey. Went to college at Virginia Tech.
There we go.
All right, there we
Can
go.
you hear me, Robert?
Yeah, Kevin, perfectly.
Yeah, I'm originally from York, so I know you're talking about well, but I moved to Virginia in 1982, and I've been here ever since in the Lynchburg area. But no, I'm originally from York.
There we go. York, you were my neighbor in Hershey and Harrisburg. And of course,
Yeah.
you were hop and skip from Gettysburg also.
Absolutely. Yeah.
My favorite battlefield in the world to visit. Yeah, Gettysburg.
Mine too.
Yeah, no question about it. And we also were lucky to live not too far from Valley Forge and a lot of wonderful places. I was in Richmond in 1982 because I was a college student in the early 80s at Virginia Tech. And I went to Richmond and Williamsburg every chance I could get. Also, Virginia Beach. I quite enjoyed all those places. And Norfolk. Am I pronouncing it correctly? I always would say Norfolk. And people would go, no, Norfolk.
Yeah.
Norfolk. But you're from a nice area, Kevin. I quite enjoy it there. So thank you. So
And I
I
think there was a question about whether that they were considered military prisons, correct? And that the guards were in the Confederate military.
Yes, yes, they were. Now, however, the guards were the worst of the worst. What the Union did is if you weren't capable of fighting, marching, if physically, mentally, you were drummed out of the service. The Confederacy could not afford to get rid of any able-bodied man. So if you were such that you had either psychological, mental, physical problems, then they made you a guard. What they did with Mary Todd Lincoln's half-brother, he was actually the warden at Libby briefly, and they did with Turner, the guy who was the warden. If you were so evil, you were made a warden. Turner was at West Point, but quit. There's mixed evidence that he might have been thrown out, might have quit West Point. He said he quit because he hated being in the North. He went to VMI, Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, if I remember correctly, Virginia. He either quit or was thrown out of that as well. He gets thrown out of basically every military unit he's in, but he's evil. So he's the perfect warden for Libby. So he was a cruel, cruel fellow. But yeah. And Cindy, be sure to visit Gettysburg, Cindy, as Kevin can attest. It's I'm a nerd. I love my history and I love my museums. As I told Kelly earlier, every time I go to Richmond, which is every year, I always go to your museum. I always do. I always go to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. I always walk down to where Libby was. I always walk up and down Tobacco Row. I always go to Shockoe, if I'm remembering the name, where the cemetery is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot
Where
of
Elizabeth Van Lew is buried.
Yep.
In Shockoe Cemetery.
Yep. And a lot of the men that died in Libby were buried there too. So yeah, I always love to go there as well. So I love to visit battlefields, and I visited battlefields all over this world. But Gettysburg's my number one favorite, as Kevin said. Probably number two is Normandy, which is just holy ground, right? Just remarkable. But so Cindy, be sure to visit Gettysburg. The interpretation there, the museum there, it's wonderful. It's really nice. And there's information on Gettysburg in the American Civil War Museum in Richmond. I read some of it while I was there as well. I think that's all of them.
I think it is. And so thank you so much for this excellent talk and lots of fascinating information. So if you're interested to learn more, buy that book, everyone out there who's.
It's my pleasure, Kelly. Oh, I just see my friend Sarah logged on. So hi, Sarah. So I got a lot of friends here today. Kevin, I got a new friend.
That's great.
Kelly, thank you. I encourage all of you to visit this museum. You will not be disappointed. I absolutely love it. It's excellent. Also, their gift shop, visit online and support their efforts. These have been a tough 19 months, especially for museums, everybody. So thanks, everyone. Kelly, thank you.
Thank you so much. It was an excellent presentation. And thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you either at one of our in-person programs or at our next virtual program. So good night, all.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Kelly.